So, welcome everyone to the sixth annual geology lecture given by Sally Green for CPRE Shropshire. It's fantastic to have so many people joining us tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Charles Green, one of the trustees of CPRE Shropshire and Sally's husband and helper tonight, and I'll be handing over to her very soon. You can find her previous 5 annual CPRE geology lectures on YouTube simply by Googling Sally Green Geology, and up they all pop.
Yeah.
Many of you, can I just ask everyone who isn't muted to mute themselves, please? Many of you are members of CPRE, but for those of you who aren't and who aren't wholly familiar with us, we are the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and we're now nationally in our centenary year of standing up for the countryside. So let me just start sharing my screen. Share screen. And I'll start our slideshow. If I can. There we go, from beginning. There's just a slight delay on the screen. So I'm just sharing on the screen something about our centenary events while I say just a little bit more about CPRE. We are unique in being a national federation of charities at the interface of nature, farming, the environment, landscape and planning. Traditionally, we have lobbied for sensible planning policies, both at a national level with paid staff and here in the county branches at a local level, mainly via volunteers. And many of you will already know that we in Shropshire have also been running a very successful Hedgerow Heroes project for the last 5 years, funded through National CPRE. And actually today we've just finished planting the last of this season's hedges. So we've planted just over 6 kilometres of hedges this season, which is fantastic. And also running a whole series of hedgerow related courses and events. When I say we, it's all masterminded by our branch manager, Sarah Jameson, who's also set up this Zoom link for tonight and is recording it. So can I just give early notice of some of our centenary events, and there they are on the screen, which include firstly a series of geological walks through time around the county, which will be led by Sally and Mike Streetley from the Shropshire Geological Society. And that also involves Andrew Howe and some art events in amongst that. Booking for those is via Eventbrite and is now open, and the first event is already oversubscribed. And then secondly, for members, our forthcoming CPRE Shropshire AGM, which this year will be held on, as it says there, on Thursday, the 25th of June at the magnificent Pitchford Hall, including a guided tour. And then over on the right, on 24th and 25th of October, a weekend celebrating a very special Hedgerow in the Hills event, which promises to be a fantastic event. So just put that down in your diaries. So coming now to Sally's talk, which is what you've been waiting for. This event is free, but we would be grateful for any donations you can make, which you can make via our website and the Just Giving button on its front page. There'll be a reminder about that at the end of the lecture. But now it's over to Sally at last, and I just say she has been advised earlier today to shun prolixity, logorrhea, and bloviation. So here we are, over to Sally.
Do I get to be on
No,
there?
you don't. You're not seen.
I'm not seen at all. I don't get seen at all. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm absolutely delighted that so many people want to come and hear me talk about fossils on this, my sixth annual geology lecture for CPRE. I don't tax myself too much, and I thoroughly enjoy spending the 3 months between Christmas and Easter doing the research for these talks and creating my my lecture visually. Um, so I want to stress that this talk is aimed at non-specialist fossil people. So if there are any sort of experts on the call, you may find yourself being a little frustrated and know everything I say because you probably do. But it's aimed at those who don't know a huge amount about fossils or where they are in Shropshire, but would like to. So I'm going to aim my talk at them. And there'll be time for you to ask questions at the end. So fire away, Charles.
So I'd say we're expecting the talk to be about an hour and a half, with perhaps half an hour for questions at the end.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you're probably thinking, what on earth have fossils got to do with the landscape, which is the our remit for CPRE? Well, in actual fact, quite a lot. Shropshire is, as you know, hosts of a huge variety of different rock types from different eras and is particularly rich, therefore, in hosting life from numerous different eras in the past 700 million years. And then, fairly obviously, in order to go and hunt fossils, you have to go out into the country. So it's a way of luring you couch potatoes out into the countryside to go and search for fossils, which is quite a challenge, really. Some places are richer than others, and it really takes a good eye to find fossils. And incidentally, I mean, I started life over half my life down in Oxfordshire, where there are a lot of fossils because they're younger rocks, and they're actually quite easier to find. But moving up here to Shropshire 20 years ago, I found a completely different array of fossils, and have had a great time trying to find some with fairly mixed success. Secondly, the position of Shropshire throughout the Paleozoic era, which is the Precambrian, Cambrian, Silurian, right up to the Permian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian, was mostly sited on the leading edge of the small continent of Avalonia, which broke off from Gondwana, which was way down in the southern hemisphere at the time, and travelled across the Iapetus Ocean. And we were therefore right on a shoreline which was ever changing, ever evolving, moving through different climatic areas, and therefore the perfect cradle for early life, about which more in a minute. And I think probably quite importantly, Shropshire, because of the richness of Paleozoic fossils, older fossils, has a very special place in the history of geological research throughout the Georgian and Victorian times. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the personalities involved in these eras, which are absolutely fascinating. And then the second part of the talk, I will focus on the actual fossils, and bearing in mind that each era hosted life far less than what we have now. So imagine trying to log and describe life at the moment, all the different biota, all the different animals, plants, all the rest of it. It's an impossible task. So I have had to be very, very selective and pick out the fossils that are most recognizable, most important, and I sadly forget all the rest. So be aware that I'm only picking a tiny, tiny proportion of all the fossils that ever existed.
And
99.9% of animal life does not end up as a fossil. It's extremely rare to become a fossil. Conditions have to be exactly right. So it's a difficult business. Next, please. Right. So here you see the the fairly familiar Tog Hill geological map of Shropshire to remind you just how varied it is. Um, I expect most of you know what these rocks are, but all the orange and yellow in the north of the county are the Permo-Triassic rocks, which were formed in a very warm desert, um, and in fact are very, very fossil poor. And on the right, I've actually blanked out the areas of Shropshire where it really isn't worth your while going to look for fossils. Doesn't mean there are no fossils, but they're just very fossil poor. So I really wouldn't waste time. You will find fossils because of the glaciation and the fact that fossils were dumped along with all the other rocks in the glacial till. But you know, you've got to be lucky to find them. Far northwest, we have the dark and light blue. Those are the Liassic outcrop surrounding Preece, which is a very distant outlier of Cotswold stones, the lower Lias, and that is fossil rich. On the other hand, it's quite a small, Preece Hill is quite small. There are at the moment no quarries really that I know of. And so it's also not an easy place to find fossils, although they are abundant in this area. On the left, you have the Oswestry Hills, and these are worth going to. See where the red dot is. They're particularly the quarries in the limestone, which host a lot of fossils, the Cefnifedu sandstone, and just out of County North, in the coal measures, is the wonderful Brimbo, which you may have all heard of, where recently, very recently, has been found an absolutely amazing fossil forest, which is now being made very public and is being excavated by volunteers who are slowly chipping out a forest from the bedrock surrounding it. Absolutely amazing. Further south, I have blocked it out. Don't bother to go to any of the Precambrian rocks, the volcanic rocks about which I spoke last year. So if you want to know where they are, you can look at my lecture from last year, because it predated most life, not all, but most. And because it's, volcanoes, you're not going to find much of interest in terms of life. So that excludes the Uricanian volcanoes, the Wrekin, even the Longmynd, which is a sedimentary rock from the volcanic rocks, but there's no life to speak of there at all. But these red dots on the right are where you will find fossils, particularly in the light blue areas, the Silurian rocks. So you've got the Hope Shales on the top left, with sites that are particularly rich in trilobites, graptolites, and the Silurian rocks generally. And of course, Wenlock Edge on the right, point to that, Charles, there. Very, very rich in fossils. I'll tell you more about that later. So those are just broadly the areas worth going fossicking if you're going to take up this new hobby. Bottom right, we have the old red sandstone. Again, not rich in fossils, but because they were laid down in another desert era, when we were in the south, towards the southern climes, though there are fossil fish and they are occasionally found, but you will not find them casually as you're wandering around. So I wouldn't really bother with the Clee Hills for that. No, you want to go to, I'll tell you where to go a little bit later if that's what you'd like to do. Next, please. Okay, so fossils and the landscape. Well, I come originally from what was North Berkshire, but became Oxfordshire, very close to the White Horse, which is on the north end of the Berkshire Downs, the large area of Cretaceous chalk in the south of England, which we have none of in Shropshire, but which may once have been in Shropshire and totally eroded off. The jury's still out on that. Now, chalk is entirely made of tiny, tiny fossil, what we call coccoliths, unicellular floating algae, protistas, call them what you like, which swarmed the shallow seas in the Cretaceous era, died, sank to the bottom, split up, and gradually built up into a huge pile of this pure white limestone, almost 100% calcium carbonate. So, fossils are very relevant down in the chalklands. And we do have many areas of limestone in Shropshire. So on the right, we have Priest Hill, which is early Jurassic rocks. As I say, it's a little bit ectopic to the rest of Shropshire. And that is also from a shallow sea in the early Jurassic period. And you can't see the fossils, but they're there. And when they put the bypass through, I think in the mid 1980s, a lot of fossils came out, many of which are now in the Shropshire museums, akin to the sort of fossils you'll find in the lower parts of the Cotswolds. Bottom left, of course, is the Great Wenlock Edge, which started life as, in the middle picture, a giant reef. In the Silurian era, when there was a shallow, warm sea, the piece of the crust that was Shropshire at those times was in the tropics, heading as my former lectures have told you, the piece of crust that was Shropshire was moving gradually north on this piece of small area island called Avalonia, and coral reefs developed. Coral evolved slightly before the Silurian, but huge amounts of coral beasts built up gradually. And when it finally was uplifted, we were left with this wonderful linear range of hills with Wenlock Edge and the Amestree limestone behind it, entirely made from organic life, as indeed to the lower right was the Lanamunnock Hill and the Oswestry Hills, which are carboniferous limestone, which were created in the same process, but several million years later, quite a number of million years later. Though Lanamunnock, which isn't quite as obvious that they are of organic origin, but all limestones are, in fact. A lot of this life was chemically altered and re-sedimented as limestones. So these all pertain to organic origins. Next, please. And in some places in Shropshire, you can literally see that the rocks are made of fossils, particularly here in Norbury and Wentnor, which are on the South Shropshire Hills, on the south side of them. Two villages. And if you look closely at the building stones and the walls, you will see, as on the left, these are packed pentamarid brachiopods, which must have lain around on a shallow sort of shoreline in their trillions, packed together, broke up, and concreted over the centuries and the millennia to form pentamerous mudstones. And it's very obvious if you look at these things. The next one is just a picture of the Wenlock coral reef, again, absolutely packed with fossils, composed of fossils, things called ballstones, which were concretions surrounding fossils. Next, please. Okay, just to remind you here, if you've seen my previous lectures, you'll know about this, but these is to remind you where the continents were during the Paleozoic. These are the Cambrian, Ordovician and Silurian eras, when complex multicellular life was young and evolving rapidly. In among large extinction events and ice ages and that sort of thing. So here you see on the left where we were, early Ordovician, late Cambrian, sitting on the red dot, that is England and Wales, attached to the north end of Gondwana land, and the square in the middle is the South Pole. So it was very, very cold. It was southern climes. Um, and what later became Scotland was on a different chunk of crust called Laurentia, some a long way away. Eventually, in the early Ordovician, Avalonia broke away from Gondwana, and through the process of subduction from plate tectonics, Avalonia was drawn across this sea, the Iapetus Ocean, and eventually in the Silurian, they actually fused. And how do we know this? Many people say, how on earth do you know what happened to these continents? And this is where fossils play a very large part, because it was noticed quite early that the trilobites particularly, but all other fossils, which were identified as being from early Cambrian, early Ordovician, were quite different in England and Wales from those in Scotland, and indeed from other parts of the world. But by the time we get to the end of the Silurian, the trilobites were all the same. So presumably at the beginning, when they're separated by a wide ocean, these little creatures couldn't swim across this big ocean, so they didn't interbreed. But gradually, as the ocean narrowed, interbreeding became possible. And so at the end of the Silurian, when they had fused, the trilobites were all very similar. And this process is being looked at all over the globe now, from which has been devised a lot of these continental movements and breakups, etc., along with other more sophisticated things like geomagnetism and the location of various minerals. So it's just one way. And just to remind you, this is what it would have looked like in Shropshire in the Ordovician, when we had these many, many shorelines, which were the perfect nursery for early fossils. Life, in fact, was entirely in marine until late in the Silurian. Nothing had actually found a way of crawling out of the water and overcoming all the challenges of defying gravity. And the Earth was completely barren, so there were no plants. So this is a picture of life in a shoreline. Next, please. Okay, we go back to this probably familiar icon of just to demonstrate just how immense life has, the time that life has evolved on Earth. Bear in mind that Earth is reckoned to be about 4.6 billion years old. And that in itself is actually very young compared to the age of the universe, which is reckoned to be about 14 billion years. So, the Earth is actually quite a young planet. But when it first appeared, coalesced from lots and lots of little bits of material around, it was very, very hot, very inhospitable, completely hostile to life. But it didn't take all that long. This is, by the way, equivalent to a 24-hour clock. So, time starts at the top, and then advances as we go round, like a clock. The Earth cooled gradually, and it is thought that by only about 4 billion years ago, very simple life evolved. And nobody knows exactly why and how this happened. course, there are many, many theories. It's always reckoned that some of it arrived on meteorites, or that in archaeans, which tiny animals that could tolerate very, very high temperatures, were the first to evolve, as they still sit around very hot springs in, say, Yellowstone. But there were simple unicellular life forms, such as the top right, which is a fossilized example. As time went on, these things diversified, but were still very, very simple. And by 3.2 million years ago, the process of photosynthesis started to happen. 3.2 thousand million, yeah, sorry. Which was absolutely crucial for subsequent life, because photosynthesis produces oxygen, takes in carbon dioxide, produces oxygen. So it actually gave rise gradually to an atmosphere, which of course was crucial. And subsequent life developed thanks to the oxygen in the atmosphere, to the oceans, which had settled by this time. Again, no one knows exactly why, but many theories. Bottom right here, we see a thing called a stromatolite. And these things still live on, there are still examples of these, particularly in Shark Bay in Australia, but I've seen them in northwest Scotland. Very early life, which was mainly algae, formed these circular banded structures, and they are just a simple life that formed into these circular structures, as I say. So we carry on round, and it took a very, very long time before multicellular life developed. And the very earliest multicellular life has been seen, or I think it's actually earlier life forms have now been found, but we're going to something like 600 to 700 million years ago. An entire biota, as we call it, suddenly developed. And in Britain, a schoolboy in Leicestershire named Mason noticed these very regular fern-like images, bottom here, Charles, on the rocks in Charnwood Forest in Leicestershire. And that was an example of this Ediacaran biota. And quite a lot of soft-bodied, they'd fossilized because they had soft bodies in a very fine matrix, most of which would not have fossilized. But since the discovery of these Charnian fossils, many different instances of Ediacaran biota have been found around the world. So that's well established. However, they literally all disappeared by some natural catastrophe afterwards. I'm not sure if it was an ice age or volcanic eruptions altering the atmosphere. They all disappeared. Although it's surmised that some of them may have seen through and given rise to later forms, but we're not sure. In Shropshire, we do have Ediacaran aged rocks in the Long Mynd, which is a sedimentary rock, which I've said formed from the volcanic sediments from the Uriconian volcanoes near Church Stretton, the Caradoc, etc. And some time ago, it was noticed that there were these little round bubble-like things in various places. And first of all, it was reckoned that these were simply fossilized rain pits. But I'm not quite sure what the current thinking is. But I believe that it's thought now that they're actually gas bubbles, methane bubbles probably, released by algal mats, which were very ubiquitous in early life forms. So yeah, there was probably early life here. And then, of course, later, appeared the famous Cambrian explosion about 570 million years ago, at the beginning of the Cambrian era. What's my timeline on? Suddenly, hard shells developed, and that was an absolutely crucial stage in the evolution of. Oh yes, in the evolution of complex life. A chap called Walcott in Western Canada in the late 1800s came across an absolutely amazing area high up in the Rockies of these extraordinary life forms, which again have turned up all over the world, particularly in China, Newfoundland, the same sort of creatures. And most of these disappeared completely, again through natural disasters. But some of them were the early instances of fossils that later developed into complex life, particularly trilobites, various worms. But they were very extraordinary life forms. And in fact, another important thing about fossils is that they tell you a lot about the ecology, the way life interacted with its environment and so forth. So there's a big emphasis on ecology through fossil hunting now. Next, please. Okay. Some time ago, as part of our centenary, we were very lucky to be issued with a grant to give us to do some CPRE projects in the community. And I was lucky enough to be able to spend a day with 7 to 8-year-olds in a primary school in Ludlow. So the diagram on the right is what I've been telling you in a sort of simplified form that children could understand. And I had an absolutely super day with these lovely 7 to 8-year-olds who were not only intensely curious, very excited. And in the afternoon, we went for a walk down over Ludford Bridge, along what they call the bread walk. We looked at the cliffs, and they all scrabbled around in the rocks at the bottom of the cliffs looking for fossils, coming up to me in their excitedly, "Is this a fossil, miss? Is this a fossil?" I hope that I would instill the beginning of an interest in fossils in these lucky children who live in the cradle of rich Shropshire fossils. So I hope to repeat this. And I'm very pleased I was invited because geology has now found its way into the national curriculum for 7 to 8-year-olds. As it certainly should, and it certainly should have a bigger part in
an initiative through the Shropshire Geological Society, wasn't it?
Oh yes, well no, I chummed up with Shropshire Geological Society, who were invited to find someone to do this teaching. So there we are. Next, please. Okay, so how do fossils form? Big subject. I can't hope to talk about everything, but in essence, when something dies, the body decomposes, and 99% of it is eaten up by scavengers, bacteria, fungi, you name it. But occasionally, luckily, the body is very quickly encased in sediment, say the bottom of a landslide or undersea slide, particularly volcanic ash. If you're lucky, and the body gradually gets buried by later sediments. And gets trapped, and then more and more sediment lies on top. And as this happens, the temperature rises, as it does, the pressure rises, and changes happen to the mineralogy of your body. So certain minerals will invade the corpse really, and the cells accept the minerals, and you find eventually that it all turns to rock. And then millions of years later, the whole thing erodes off, and your fossils are exposed. So that's the main way the things are fossilized. Occasionally, bottom left, minerals. So in this case, I think it's a aragonite or pyrite. If there's sulfur in your beastie, you'll get these lovely shiny pyritized fossils. Quite a lot of those found in the Dorset Jurassic coast. Wood fossilizes. The cells of the wood are gradually invaded by silicaceous solutions, which mineralize them. So fossil forests retain the structure of the wood from which they're derived, and become fossils. And then fossil hunting, as I say, the ecologists are very interesting because animals create all sorts of signs of their presence. And here in the middle, we have the fossilized tracks of trilobites. It got the wonderful name of Cruziana. But many animals will have tracks that fossilize. And these are almost as interesting as the fossils themselves because they tell you a good deal about the behavior of the fossil. On the right, we have a dinosaur footprint. I'm not sure if that's a Shropshire one, but I think it's a bit bigger than our Rhynchosaurus from the Triassic. But dinosaur, all sorts of animal tracks are left. We also have burrows, worm burrows. And whenever you've been in mid Wales, particularly, and smashed open your shale, you'll find all sorts of wonderful little sort of squirrels and wiggles, which you probably ignore. But many of them are actually showing you the perturbation of animal life in these fossils, in these rocks, billions of years ago. So there are all sorts of signs of animal life, but that have solidified and become rock, but are not the actual animal. Okay, next, please. Okay, and I will have to mention these wonderful people. Some of you will have heard of him, but these two paleontologists, Lucy Muir and Joe Botting, some 15 years ago, well, 10 years before the beginning of lockdown, were poking around in the rocks in the Llandrindod Hills, which are volcanic, but came up through sediments, discovered these tiny little black marks on the rocks. And Joe, I think, realized quite quickly that these were actually tiny animals. And the rocks were from the Middle Ordovician, about 460 million years ago. And he was actually looking at a brand new biota. Biota means a complete sort of set of life, of small creatures. And all they were little carbonaceous sort of ticks on the rocks. You and I would not have known that these were animals, but Joe, being a professional, realized that they were, and that they were very important. And he and Lucy gave up their academic jobs in paleontology, moved to Llandrindod Wells, and during lockdown spent a lot of time in this one very small stratum in a farm quarry, taking out these tiny little black fossils. For some reason, animal life had got very small at this time. I've not really heard the reason why. Crowd-funded a microscope and have actually produced a complete new biota, which is very important because it's they've found many brand new species never known to science before. The artist impression on the left is some of these curious creatures from the middle of the Ordovician. And in fact, you can go on YouTube, and there are several very interesting lectures by Joe Botting, which are ongoing. So I can recommend Lucy and Joe. And if you go to Landrindon Wells Museum, I think at the moment they have a little exhibition of these wonderful fossils. So remember the Castle Bank biota, um, fossilized by literally everything on the animal evaporated except for the carbon, leaving these black marks. Okie doke, next please. Okay, I suppose I needed to say a little bit about how we classify all these things. Got very tied up in the distant difference between cladistics, which is a fairly latter day way of classifying fossils and organisms, and the traditional taxonomy. And that goes back to Linnaeus. As you see, life was classified into kingdoms, phylums, class, order, family, genus, species. And well, this is a bit ahead of its time, but you see, we've got his little Victorian, this vicar here. So vicars in Shropshire in Victorian times seem to have an awful lot of free time. And we have a plethora of them who went out and collected fossils, many of which were used subsequently by professional geologists, plagiarized really. But these vicars learned a huge amount and always liked to put them into classification. We all like doing that. Anyway, the way every fossil has to have two names, a Latin name and then another Latin name. Is that right, Charles?
Genus name and species name.
Genus name and species name. I didn't do biology A level, so I'm very ignorant about this. But more recently, a different way of classifying life has been developed, this thing called cladistics, based on the evolutionary characteristics of fossils. So basically, you find all the creatures that have got the same sort of features, like, you know, they've all got a trunk, or they've all got the same kind of legs.
No, that's this one.
No, they're both the same, but they all descend from a common ancestor, or they think they do. Anyway, I'll leave it to the experts to tell you more about that. So I'm sure you can, but this is important in fossil science. Next, please. Okay. All right. So again, Shropshire's place in the history of geological research, particularly in Victorian times, but actually going back to before that, to the 1700s, when geology really took off. Think of Mary Anning in Lyme Regis. She was in the late 1700s. So the importance of fossils for dating was recognised. But, of course, throughout these Victorian times, Christian many were led to believe the word of the Bible. And Bishop Ussher interpreted that the creation of the world began at precisely nightfall preceding October the 23rd, 4004 BC. So, you know, the everything is 6,000 years old. But academic geologists very soon realised that this was most unlikely, but they had to keep stum about it, really. So later on, by tacit agreement, they realised it was preposterous, but some stuck to their the early biblical beliefs for fear of disapproval. Really, it's incredible, but throughout history, people have been fascinated by fossils. I mean, prehistoric cultures have been shown to collect fossils and make jewellery out of them. So they are fascinating, and people have wondered about them. And these Victorian vicars were particularly clever at hunting them down. They must have had a lot of free time, I think, and working out important facts about them. So here are some notable examples connected with Shropshire. I'll start with the Reverend Edward Llewyd, who was born in Loppington, not far from Oswestry, where we live, between Oswestry and Wem. He went to Oswestry School and then on to Jesus College, Oxford, and became a very, very noted academic, actually. And during this time, he had relatives down in, I think, Llandilo. He must have found this trilobite and made a sketch of it and surmised that it was some kind of flatfish. That's about all. Later on, the Reverend Edward Llewyd became very, very well known for as a linguist, and he was the person that devised the classification of the Celtic languages, the P and the Q languages and their connections. And he became the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which I know well, having lived in Oxford for many years in my youth. Another famous vicar, here we have Dr. Thomas Lloyd. He was a Victorian doctor, as all the best people, an amateur geologist, and he discovered the crucial Ludlow bone bed, which he showed to Roderick Murchison, a famous academic geologist, when he came through Shropshire, which was deemed by Murchison to be the boundary between Silurian and Devonian. Later found to be a little bit wrong, but the idea was there. But he pinched a lot of Lloyd's ideas and his fossils, but not as much as the Reverend Thomas Taylor Lewis from Amestree in North Herefordshire, just out of county. But he collected fossils very zealously, in abundance, strewed over the roads and fields. Okay. So he amassed a lot of fossils, and he was made known to Murchison when he was wandering around the border counties looking for fossils in order to establish the dates of the geological periods and eras. And there was a lot of correspondence between Lewis and Murchison. Stayed with him, I think, as he was doing his work. But when Murchison became very famous and very senior in the London academic geological work, he rather nastily failed to credit Lewis with a lot of the work which he had in fact done. So he was also assisted in the formation of the Woolhope Club. Is that right? Yes. Yeah, the Woolhope Club, which is a geological club that exists till this day and has done a lot of work. So there we have it, the Victor. And another later vicar, the Reverend James Diggs-Latouche, who was the vicar of Stokesay, a generation later, amassed a fantastic collection of Shropshire fossils and wrote this book, The Handbook of Geology of Shropshire, which I implore anyone who's watching this and wants to know more about Shropshire fossils to get hold of this book. This is a reprint, in fact, but it's freely available on the internet. And he drew them and copied them, and he probably got his wife to do it because they mostly did. And in fact, unfortunately, the reprint is not very good for some of them, but every fossil that you're ever likely to find in Shropshire is in this book. And there we are, going back to the mid-1800s. So he was another fantastic collector. But he also, unfortunately, his work was interrupted when he was ordered off to India in the days of empire to become a surveyor in India. So he was lost to Shropshire. And these, of course, are the most famous geologists connected with Shropshire. The amazing Adam Sedgwick and Rodney Murchison. Now, sorry?
Roderick Murchison.
Oh, Roderick Murchison. Did I say Rodney? Roderick Murchison. Better get it right. Um, okay, so Sedgwick, who was born in Dent in Yorkshire, got himself into Cambridge, worked his way up the academic uh, scale in Cambridge, but he also took holy orders, as you see from the icon here, um, and spent his life divided really between lecturing in Cambridge in geology and being a cleric in Norwich, I believe, and enjoyed really poor health, but became a very close friend of Roderick Murchison, who had a totally different background. He'd been born in Scotland, in Taradale near Inverness, um, and was actually a soldier. He went to military schools and came from a military family, and saw the end of the Napoleonic Wars when he must have been quite young. Came back to Britain, and he was from the landed gentry, and he really didn't know what to do when he came back. Did a lot of fox hunting and game shooting, etc., etc. But got married, and his wife, who I think had quite a lot of money, persuaded him that he needed to take up a career, and persuaded him into geology. So Murchison, being sort of rigid military man, took this very seriously, learned a lot of geology, and chummed up with Adam Sedgwick. And at this time, they were trying to devise the periods, the eras of geological time. Now, William Smith, just around the early 1800s, was the first to devise a geological map when he was helping to survey Britain for the canal system. And he realised that there were similar rocks laid down in strata, and he surveyed the whole of the south of England and devised the first geological maps. Now, that was fine because it was fairly horizontal, and it was fairly obvious which rocks were which. But they weren't really able to work out what happened in Wales and the west of England, where the rocks were clearly very hard, very old, and not quite so clear cut. So these two fine men chummed up and set off from their horse and carriage with with Murchison with his wife, and wandered all over mid Wales, visiting these vicars, plagiarising their work as much as they could. I mean, Murchison was taken to the Ludlow bone bed and they sort of devised, they worked out the Silurian system, and they knew about the Cambrian system. And Murchison went round South Wales and the border country, and he sent Sedgwick off to North Wales, where Sedgwick surveyed the ancient rocks of North Wales, the Cambrian rocks, and they came back and sort of wrote up what they've found. And Sedgwick fairly quickly realised that the younger of the rocks that he'd surveyed overlapped with the oldest rocks that Murchison had surveyed. And he got a rather antsy about this. He thought this wasn't really fair because Murchison was claiming his rocks to be Silurian, and Murchison wasn't happy that Sedgwick was claiming his rocks for the Cambrian. So they fell out, and they fell out spectacularly. And by this time, both of them had made their way to the higher echelons of geological academics in London, the geological societies, etc. And this rift became worse and worse and worse. partly because Murchison was very vigorous and he went prancing off to places like Russia, um, where in fact he denoted the Permian rocks and named them Permian after the town of Perm in the Ural Mountains. Meanwhile, Sedgwick was busy being a cleric in Norfolk and not writing up his work. So there was a rift. And this rift actually never resolved in their lifetimes, which is rather tragic, actually, because they both contributed so much to the science of geology. And one thing Sedgwick did, which was rather wonderful, was found the Cambridge Museum, which has developed into the absolutely wonderful Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge, which, having a daughter in Cambridge, I visit every time I go to Cambridge, and is stuffed with wonderful fossils, etc. And there's this statue, in fact, has him with his arm outstretched holding a trilobite. And these are the actual shoes that he used to walk around in the Lake District, in fact, doing his surveys. So, if you want to know more about this, get hold of this book, The Grey Wacky, which tells you all about this rift and all about the way in Victorian eras they went about surveying the rocks.
Better move on.
Okay, yes, next. Okay, and this, of course, the famous Charles Darwin, known best for The Origin of Species, his thoughts on evolution. But he actually was a very skilled geologist and was a pupil of Sedgwick's in Cambridge in the early 1800s. And Sedgwick famously came on his travels to North Wales, came to Shrewsbury, met Charles Darwin's family, and Darwin went with him on his travels around North Wales. And he was taught all sorts of geological techniques. In fact, there's a little plaque if you come to Lanamonach, go up towards the Tannivoil, it's called, right on the English-Welsh border. And there's what we call an unconformity between the Ordovician rocks and the Carboniferous rocks there. And there's a little plaque saying this is where Darwin learned how to use a clinometer, which was an instrument to see what the angle of strata was. Next, please. Okay, and here are the modern Shropshire geologists. John Norton of Ludlow, who amassed a large fossil collection, unfortunately died in 2002, but he set up the Ludlow Museum, and he donated a large collection of fossils to Shrewsbury Museum and to academics. And of course, our very own Peter Toghill, who's alive and well, and a member of our Shropshire Geology Society, who wrote this book. And if there's nothing else you buy, many of you probably have this book already, but it tells you everything you'll ever need to know about Shropshire geology. It's a brilliant book and inspired me greatly. In fact, I probably plagiarised a lot of his work, but there we go. And then, of course, we have Lapworth, who finally resolved this dilemma, this conundrum between the Cambrian and the Silurian rocks, by actually creating or proposing a brand new period, the Ordovician period, which took quite a long time to be accepted internationally. But he did a huge amount of work and became a professor in Birmingham University when it was Mason, one of my alma maters, and mentored a lot of younger geologists. Okay, where's my hat for the next one? Yeah, never mind. Okay, next on. And next, please. These are my current absolute heroines. Lapworth mentored these wonderful women. There were 4 women, the quartet of Cambridge female geologists. Now, they all and I hate them for this because Cambridge turned me down for this course. They all read natural sciences at Cambridge with an emphasis on geology. Um, and of course, in those days, we're talking about the end of the 1800s, they were not granted degrees because women weren't. But these women were superb geologists, superb field geologists. And they formed this quartet under the tutelage, really, of Lapworth, and did vast amount of field work, um, and wrote books about their work. I particularly admire this lady Gertrude Ellis on the left, who pioneered graptolite geology and was regarded as amazing and slightly eccentric. And I think that's an understatement because I know why I didn't get into Cambridge to read natural sciences, because I didn't have a woolly hat. She was famous for being so eccentric that she actually ended up being an academic in Cambridge. Her house was an absolute tip, and her tables were covered in rocks and God knows what. But whenever anyone turned up with any new specimens, she simply swept them all off the table onto the floor. So it was a horrendous mess. But she was very much admired and very clever.
To speed up.
And Dame Ethel Woods was her friend. And between them, these four were commissioned by Lapworth to go and survey graptolites. Now, graptolites, did you want to go on the next one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, one of the ladies, Ethel Skeet, there's no photos, so I had to take a picture of her gravestone. They, between them, produced this amazing book called The Monograph of British Graptolites. And we're talking about the turn of the century, about 1900. And it's a collection of monographs produced taking 17 years. These women scattered around went and surveyed. Graptolites are an amazing fossil that's, well, I actually advise, if you're going to take up fossil hunting, these are the first things you need to look for. They're what we call indicator fossils, and all they were tiny, tiny creatures that floated about in the ancient oceans, died, fell down, settled on the rocks, leaving a very little carbonaceous mark that just looks like, as you see, looks like a pencil mark. But they are everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere, and they're quite easy to spot. And you will find them on any rocks, Ordovician rocks, Silurian rocks, Devonian rocks, right up to the Carboniferous. And these women, between them, surveyed the Long Mount in particular. Ethel Woods, who became a teacher in Chester for a while. And you can imagine these women in a time when it wasn't, women were generally chaperoned about, but they would take the train. She would take the train from Chester to Welshpool, get a horse and a trap, head up to the Long Mountain, where in those days there would have been a lot less tree cover, more open quarries. The roads weren't tarmac, so there would have been open rocks on the roads. And they looked around and they collected thousands and thousands of different graptolites, and wrote this monograph, which is amazing. And the book, incidentally, go back, I heard about it and I went to the second-hand bookshop in Shrewsbury, talked to the nice Neil Robinson that runs it, asked him if he had a copy of this. Oh, no, he'd never heard of it. But I'll find one, he said. And bless him, not 3 or 4 days later, he turned up at our farm, because he lives quite near us, in person, bearing this magnificent book, charged me a whole £5 for it, plus £10 carriage, but we won't talk about that. And inside it said it had been in the library at Oxford Polytechnic, so I felt that was rather apt, really. And I found if you want to buy one of these off the internet, it'll cost you about £450. So I was pretty lucky. And it is amazing. And it's still the definitive um, dictionary of graptolites. These are just, oh, and Ethelwoods did all the drawings in this, all very, very neat. And each one of these is reckoned to be a different species. And the point about these graptolites is that they are very, very good index fossils. So they evolved very, very quickly. So they, you can date a rock, to within perhaps 1,000 years through what graptolites are on it. So there we are. Amazing. Okay, well, you've been very patient so far. How long have we got?
So an hour
We've
in,
had
we've
an
got to
hour of
part
that.
two.
Yeah, I'm into part two now. Now we'll talk
Actual
about the
fossils.
fossils, and I will whiz through a little bit quicker because it's easy to get very boring. So I don't know if anybody's still there because I can't see you, but I hope so. Next, please. So we'll start with these graptolites. As you see, they're very tiny fossils, and you wouldn't hardly notice them if you didn't know they were there. This is a picture of the graptolites in life. They started life in the Cambrian era as sort of branched beasties which were tethered to the sea floor, it's thought. But as time went on, they extracted themselves from the sea floor, floated up to the surface, and became diplogracti at the bottom, sort of tuning fork. If you've ever been to Aberystwyth in southwest Wales, there are cliffs there which are absolutely covered in these diplograpti. And as the time went on, they actually became simpler, surprisingly, and just became single-bladed. And you have to look at these things pretty carefully, but you see they like a sort of hacksaw blade. And a vital piece of equipment to anyone who wants to go fossiling is a magnifying glass, so you can see these things more clearly. And if you look to the left, this is, it might not have been known that these were actually animals as opposed to plants, but in fact, these long, thin thecae, we call them, the stipes, have all these little pouches, basically, with an animal inside that pops out, waves around, and catches any micro foods that might be wafting past them. And they multiplied by sprouting from these the bit at the bottom, really. And then later in their evolution, they adopted these extraordinary shapes, these circles and branching shapes. And they hung around for, oh goodness knows, 200 million years. So they were around for a very long time, but they did eventually die out. So you're not going to find a living graptolite anywhere, but fascinating creatures. Right, now we're going to talk about brachiopods, which are just shells, basically. Not the say sexiest of fossils, but they are easy to find, and there are a lot of them, and they've been around for many, many millions of years. So on this slide, you see the pentamerids that I was telling you about that abound in Norbury and Wentnor, which are the brachiopods are basically shells that are hinged on one side. So it has a top side and a bottom side. And that opens slightly to allow in filter feeding. They've got a filter feeding mechanism. And there are living brachiopods, which, as you can't imagine, in the Far East are quite a delicacy because the soft parts are edible. So these are different types of brachiopods. And this is just a tiny fraction of the huge number of different species. And these are something you might well find. They're probably the easiest fossils to find anywhere. Bottom left is what we call a Gigantoproductus, which I found in the Dolgoch quarry in the Oswestry Hills. So they were around in the Carboniferous, um, pentamerids of Silurian. The Spanish, they're still, I say, they're still alive, still now. And these exquisite little things from the Oswestry Racecourse Quarry, sadly, was recently sized through by somebody who bought the Landvorder estate and destroyed, or partly destroyed, this quarry. And that's in the interface of the Oswestry Carboniferous limestone and the Carboniferous Kefnifedo sandstones. Um, but you'll find these everywhere. Next, please. Yeah, these are different brachiopods. I found this brachiopod on the top left on the long mountain when I was looking for graptolites. Spirifers, beautiful things. They're very long lived as well. Two spirifers there. That's a different kind of brachiopod that came from, I forget where. I won't say that. And this is these Gigantoproducti in Dolgoch, which were huge at the time in Carboniferous. Everything became big because there was a huge amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So these life forms were able to, like all the insects, grew very big. But very tragically, and this is something that's awful, really, that there is a market for these fossils, for a lot of fossils. And last year I went to the Dolgoch quarry to find that some nasty person had actually broken up several of these big rocks containing these Gigantoproductors, presumably to extract the fossils. So that's the downside of fossil hunting. There we are, carry on. Other brachiopods on the left, we see a very ancient brachiopod, which incredibly is still living. There are living samples of these lingula. I think these I found somewhere in near Dolgethley. There's a quite narrow stratum which are packed with these lingulae. These were attached to the sea floor with a long stalk and had soft parts inside, and persisted right up to the modern day. There's some brachiopods from the Sidgwick Museum, or unless that's at the archives. I've been hunting around for fossils for several months now, and I've been to the Sidgwick Museum in Cambridge a couple of times, and the fossil stores in Ludlow couple of times. So I get a bit muddled up, but these are all different brachiopods, and they're important in that different brachiopods thrive at different sea depths. So this is a cross section of the seashore in Shropshire, which of course changed over time. And thanks to the location of these different brachiopods, it's possible to tell how deep the sea was at these times. So, like the Clorinda only thrives in deep water. So where you find that, at that time where you find them, there was a lot of a deep shore. Okay. All right, now we'll turn our attention to the trilobites, which are probably what you'd love to find if you were, and I hate to tell you that they are fairly difficult to find, but if you do, you can be very excited. Now, a trilobite is named as such because it's three parts. The image on the right, the three parts are the central axis here and the two lobes either side. But it also happens that on the left side, there are three parts to the average trilobite. There is the cephalon, which is the head area, the body area, the thorax, and the pygidium. And very often, because these are molting arthropods from the family, they molt and then they break up, and you're very likely to find one or other of these pieces. And you're jolly, jolly lucky to find an entire entire trilobite. And above, you'll see the amazing variety of adaptations of trilobites. 10 orders of trilobites have been identified and 22,000 species. So these have been studied extensively. Okay, next, please. All right, and this is the what we call the clade, as I've mentioned earlier, or the taxonomy of trilobites. They are a member of the arthropoda, which are where spiders are the modern example. So, but as you see here, they went extinct. No trilobite survived the end of the Permian extinction, the grand extinction. So there are no trilobites now, but all sorts of other arthropods did survive. Next. Okay, now the earliest Shropshire trilobites were found in the famous Cumley Quarry near Church Stretton. And here we have the wonderful Lapworth and his students from Mason College, Birmingham. Lapworth's his character with the fantastic moustache. He obviously brought a lot of students out, and they tackled these were Cambrian limestones in this one quarry at the foot of Caer Caradoc, between Caer Caradoc and the Lawley. It was obviously a hunting ground for geological students. And as you notice, there were quite a number of females here. So it's obvious that women enjoyed geology way back when and did well in it too. So here's Lapworth's drawing of, created, I think, from the pieces of trilobites they found. He devised what it would have looked like when all pieced together. And on the right, the biggest complete trilobite. Next, please. Okay, now I have a wonderful book recently acquired, which shows something like 400 trilobite specimens prepared by somebody called Kennedy and his psychic. What? Robert Kennedy and Sinclair
Yes, the
Stammers.
attribution at the bottom. Trilobites of the British Isles, Dr. Robert Kennedy and Sinclair Stammers.
And if you want to see what can be found in Britain, get hold of this book, which is newly published and has at least 400 illustrations of trilobites from all over Great Britain, many of which were taken by Andrew Cox, who is a Shropshire inhabitant, lives in Telford. And I had the pleasure to go and visit him a couple of weeks ago in Telford, who has spent 30 years assiduously seeking out trilobites, and his house is stuffed with them, and they are superb, absolutely superb. How many countless hours he spent searching for these things, and his friend, who sadly is recently deceased, preparing them. So on the right, you see this sort of white line. That's because he's chipped away at the rock around it to expose the structure of the trilobite. So these are a selection of Ordovician Shropshire trilobites, which, if you're incredibly lucky, you might find Maddox Hill, which is just behind the Arkle. These all come from the Hope Shales in the Hope Valley, Meadowtown, Betton Dingle, that area, in the north end of the South Shropshire Hills. Carry on. And these are more from various parts of Shropshire. So, absolutely superb. Next. And just a few comments about trilobites. Trilobites emerged fully formed, so to speak, in the early Cambrian, when life learned how to um, form shells around themselves and therefore um, fossilized easily. But they've emerged with their eyes fully formed, which is extraordinary, really. And they're complex eyes. They're made of calcite and multiple lenses, what we call holochroal eyes, compound eyes. Um, except on the right, we see an agnostid, which was completely blind. So it's sort of surmised that these blind trilobites, and there is even some conjecture as whether they're true trilobites, but they probably lived under the mud, scavenging around. And trilobites have multiple adaptations, which tell us about the sort of places that they lived in the water column, still all marine or in water, although they did occasionally find their way out of the water. It was the beginning of their coming out of the water. So these particular on the top left, we see their amazing eyes, compound eyes, which of course insects have to this day. And it is another sign that the whole system of predation was developing at this time. So you need eyes to sense your quarry, really. Next here are some more adaptations. A little later in the sort of into the Silurian, a lot of trilobites have these strange sort of fimbriated um, head shields, but their eyes are not so big. And it's thought that this was another sensory organ. Um, so the first trilobites I ever found were these in the middle. In fact, in Landrin Dobwell's in the self same quarry that this Cox picture was taken. And they probably sort of smelt their way around to find their prey, because their eyes are often rather rudimentary. And at the bottom, you see they developed all sorts of spines of various sizes, which were used for presumably sensing their environment in some way. And trilobites are articulated to the point their defense mechanism is to roll up in a little ball, like pill bugs and what else is it?
Woodlice.
Woodlice, that's right. So they were able to defend themselves that way. So just here's another few at the top of my own trilobites. I've got one complete trilobite on the right. Sadly, I seem to have lost it recently, but it's my fault because I'm a bit scatty like Gertrude Ellis. Some more examples of Shropshire. These are ones from the Sedgwick in Cambridge, which ones he found when he was doing his research, presumably, and brought back to Cambridge. You see some more enrolled ones at the bottom, defending themselves from the academics. Next, and I just popped this in because I think this is really fascinating. When I went to the Shropshire museum stores in Ludlow and you have to ask the what you call them, curator, to go and fetch your fossils, so it's all rather formal. But she brought this tray of trilobites, and the very first thing I found was this. And Charles is going to read out these letters in case you can't quite see
I better
them.
read it quickly. So it's from the headmaster at the time of Kinnerley School. For those of you who don't know, we live in Kinnerley Parish, and another of my roles now is chairman of Kinnerley Parish Council. So we're in Kinnerley Parish. So it's a letter to the curator of Shrewsbury Museum. Dear Sir, I enclose a piece of material for identification. A lady in Kinnerley was working outside at about 1 p.m. on Sunday last 19th May, when she heard a bang, rather like a clap of thunder. Shortly afterwards, she found the enclosed stone in a field nearby. She seems reasonably certain that the stone was not there before. She feeds the hens in the field, so goes regularly. She thinks the stone might be a piece of meteorite. Could you find out if there is a chance of this being a meteorite? There may be no grounds for thinking this, but I feel it is better to find out. P.S. If this turns out to be a meteorite, could you return it to show to the children, please? Well, it obviously never was returned, so it was never found out. And Sally thinks it looks more like a trilobite than a meteorite.
But
So it
definitely,
remains a mystery. And we think that letter is about sort of 50 years old, I think, from
yes,
the
in fact,
1960 years old, from the 1970s. And the widow of R.F. Harrison died last year at the age of 104.
we never had
Just
time to ask her, did
no.
we? So, but
Anyway,
anyway,
we
anybody who knows what that is, any of the fossil trilobite experts that might be watching, that's still to be declared. But I'm theorising that there was a I don't know a tornado that lifted this up from a quarry and then plonked it down on Kinnerley, because Kinnerley doesn't host trilobites to my best of my knowledge. But it certainly looks like one, and certainly isn't a meteorite.
moving on.
Right, moving on. I'm being hassled here.
9 o'clock now.
Is it? Oh, good God. Okay, mollusks, gastropods, bivalves. These are. I'm going to rush through vast amounts of different genera. These are other types of critters, basically, that you might find lying around in quarries in Shropshire. Mollusks, these things on the left, they're called tentaculites. And I've found those on the Onny River Trail, which is somewhere you need to go if you want to become a fossil person. Wonderful little sort of screw things. And these are gastropods. They're other kind of shells, basically. And the thing on the right is actually something from our house. Charles' grandfather was chairman of Shropshire County Council, and he was donated a number of lumps of rock, including this wonderful thing. I don't actually know what it is, but it's big, it's heavy, and it's a jolly good what do you call it?
Doorstop.
Doorstop, yes, yeah. Um, some kind of mollusk of some sort. And these are different. The thing in the middle, these eventually afterwards evolved into ammonites and things. Next, these are fossils from Wenlock Edge. Crinoids and corals, they're all a bit related, but they're what we call sea lilies. And these are things you might find on Wenlock Edge. Rather wonderful. So I just thought I'd put that in as a picture. And at the bottom right, you see these little circular bits and pieces. Those are crinoid pieces. They all tend to break up as they fall out of the cliffs. And you find these little tiny beads. In fact, primitive people have made necklaces out of these crinoid pieces. Sea lilies. Next, please. And corals make up Wenlock Edge. And there are numerous different kinds of corals. And the top right, I found it's a thing called a favosite, a tabulate corals. They sort of make like parallel, yes, tables of corals. Okay. So yeah, that's what it might have looked like in the Silurian at the time of Wenlock Edge, when it was a living coral reef. And sorry, I'm rushing through this because it's so much. And this creature was my son-in-law found this in the River Severn near Welshpool. I've never really had it identified, but there might be somebody watching here can tell me what this is. I'm imagining it's a kind of coral, and it was probably Silurian, being in that part of the world near Welshpool. It's rather fine. And then we have other the varied type of fossils on Wenlock Edge, particularly. These are brittle stars, echinoderms, the forerunners of sea urchins and starfish, etc. They evolved very early. So the one on the right is a Lapworthia, guess who that's named after. And there's sponges, and I have to put in sponges because I know Joe Botting is a sponge expert, just in case he ever sees this on YouTube. I don't want to disappoint Joe Botting, but I've never knowingly found a sponge on Wenlock Edge, and I'm sure they're everywhere, but I've never. But I do know that the famous sponges are in Farringdon, which was near where I grew up. And there are many, many sponge fossils in Farringdon. And here's an example. Okay, next. All right. And these are Wenlock oddities from the Sedgwick Museum. Is this people leaving, do you think?
No,
Oh, people making chat. Okay.
no.
So could you like to read that? Many strange creatures are found on the Wenlock limestone, including armoured worms, and I haven't mentioned worms, but they're very important, fossilised, earthworms. The shells of cornulites are unusual. Graptolites, yes, we mentioned those. I don't think there are any in the picture though. And very early fish, crinoids and echinoderms. So that's just one of the Sidgwick Museum displays. Okay. Okay, and I'm moving on now to the Devonian era, and this is a famous, famous place at Ludford Corner, just over Ludford Bridge in Ludlow, um, noted by Murchison, what they call a bone bed, at the supposed junction of Silurian rocks and Devonian rocks. When Silurian, we know life was underwater, but it was beginning to crawl out of water. In the Devonian, it turned into the world became a desert, and there were rivers in it, big rivers, and this particular stratum in Ludford Corner is shows sort of the debris from above, really, that must have settled there. Massive bits and pieces of fossil fish, bones, trilobites, everything you can imagine that settled there. And Murchison decided that this was the junction. So it's gone down in the annals as a very famous junction, really. As you see, you can go and see it in Ludlow. Next, please. And then in the Devonian, this was the age of fossil fishes. And there are Devonian fossil fish fossils, which I saw in the fossil stores, but which you'd be incredibly lucky to find. But maybe you would. This is something called Silapsis, jawless fish, quite an odd fish, really. But fishes, they evolved during this Devonian era when life was getting geared up to leave the water. So latterly, these fishes began to develop lungs, and then they developed legs, or their fins turned into legs, and they began to crawl out of the water. But you're not going to find any of these. But this is a rather fine fossil fish. If you're interested in fossil fish, go up to north of Scotland, Caithness area, where the Devonian rocks are very, very finely stratified, and fossil fish are abound. Not that we found any when we were up there last year, did we?
No.
No. Okay, we're rushing on now, and I have to condense this hugely because there's so many fossils, but we're talking about the Carboniferous, when fossil plants evolved rapidly to form the coal forests. And I can't emphasize enough that advise you to go to Brimbo to see the fossil forest that's very recently been discovered there, and is now the site of a building that's been built over it, and you can go and actually volunteer to excavate. And the trees you find are the fossilized version of these coal trees, which I don't quite know why they didn't turn into coal, these particular ones, but they didn't. And this is a mare's tail. And this is a fern here. You could see the leaf of a fern. And these are the roots, which are sitting in and every Sunday, there are guided tours around this new building, which encloses the forest. Okay, next. All right. And so here's a selection of Carboniferous fossils. Plant fossils, so famous lepidodendrons, I think they're called lepidodendrons, which became coal. So to see these, really, you should go to Wrexham Museum, where they have a lot of very fine coal forest fossils. And these on the right are my fossils from the Carboniferous. So we've got a trilobite there because they're still swarming around in the sea in the Carboniferous era, and Gigantoprodoctus. And this is a thing called a goniatite, which is a very early ammonoid, really, the very first evolution of ammonites. And here's my piece of mare's tail and some worm burrows. So those are in my conservatory. Okay, next. Okay, so now we move on to the Permo-Triassic, which, when again, North Shropshire, I said, is pretty barren for fossils, but is famous for the Rhynchosaurus. So by now, life had emerged onto land, and we have the very early, I don't know if they call them dinosaurs, but they're reptiles. And they have been found, bones and all, in Grinshill, in the quarry at Grinshill, where they quarry the building stones. So Rhynchosaurus, there we are. And then finally, going through the eras, we have the Liassic rocks. And these were you able to find any fossils there, if there were any quarries, this is what you are likely to find. These ammonites are from the Lias, which is the same as the fossils in the on the Cotswold Escarpment. That's Lias, lower Lias, middle Lias, upper Lias. So the early Jurassic. So ammonites have got going and are evolving into all sorts of different kinds. This is my collection. And to be honest, most of these have come from Oxfordshire, where you can find Liassic fossils all over the place. There's a dinosaur bone there. And we have various ammonites, not strictly speaking from the Lias, because some of them are a bit younger than that. But I was very lucky some years ago, when we still had a house down in Wantage, to go poking around the quarries near Farringdon, and a very fine, this was after hours, and a little Irish man who was the kind of foreman led us into his caravan, where he had at least 6 or 7 of these amazing ammonites, and he hadn't a clue what they were, but he thought they were very pretty, and he thought they should be saved from the crusher, and he ended up giving them to me. So now our garden is decorated with these rather wonderful ammonites, and at the bottom is a belemnite, which is another very common Liassic fossil, which actually is the spine of a squid-like creature, which nothing else fossilized, but the hard parts did. Okie doke. And here's the Agriphus. Now, these are very common Liassic fossils that you are likely to find in various places. And other specimens of ammonites, early ammonites. They'd only just evolved. Okay. Next, please. Yeah, and although this isn't a fossil, Shropshire is very famous for having hosted the Condover mammoths. As I expect people know, in 1986, a lady was walking her dog with her husband by Condover Quarry, which is a big sand quarry just south of Shrewsbury, noticed bones sticking out of this quarry. And realised that they were something interesting, called in the experts, and out came, I think, 4 mammoths, um, an adult mammoth, and I think several babies. Although I think they said they weren't from the same era, but wonderful fossils. Now, some of them are in Shrewsbury Museum, but some in Cardiff Museum because they're so exceptional. And they're not fossils, but because they haven't yet fossilized, but they are extinct animals and worth mentioning. Okay. So, right. So, if you've been enthused, we're coming to the end now. I just thought maybe you'd like to know where to go to look for good fossils in museums. So, I've got a list here, which, when this has gone out on YouTube, you could print them out. But these are um, Shrewsbury Museum. Not the best exhibition. It was much better when it was back in Rowley House when we first moved up. They had the little drawers and you could peel them out and look at all the little tiny fossils. Most of those are now down in the museum stores in Ludlow, and you have to really fight to get to see them. You have to book and you have to go on a specific day and you have to ask the curator to fetch them, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, they are there, but they were much better in the olden days. So if you are interested, I would recommend you go to Lapworth Museum in the Birmingham University campus, which is a wonderful museum stuffed with Shropshire fossils, and also the Sedgwick Museum, where Sedgwick we have a huge collection of fossils, much of which is from Shropshire. And you need to go to historic locations like Cumley Quarry, the bone bed at Ludford Bridge, Wenlock Edge, Lee Quarries, that's a fertile searching ground. Mortimer Forest it's just into Hertfordshire, but it has Herefordshire, has a trail. There are a number of quarries along the road where each quarry is just showing a little bit older or older. There are about a dozen of these. Sadly, mostly overgrown now, but if you're brave and you have your slasher, you can go and tackle these fairly small quarries and find trilobites and things. Don't forget to go to Brimbo Fossil Forest, but you do have to book, and it's only open to the public on a Sunday. But it's a new and very exciting find just out of county. And the possible fruitful locations, if you're really hardcore and want to go and look for them, but you should take heart at and get the owner's permission. The Wenlock quarries. Some are not as easy as it used to be, but you can get into them and look at what's fallen out of the cliffs. The real hardcore people go to Hope Valley, Meadowtown, Betton Dingle in the Hope Shales, which, as you see from the Andrew Cox, it is the area where most of his specimens come from. The Shinton Shales, again, I've been a few times and haven't found a sausage, but they are said to be very rich in a lot of trilobites, etc. The Long Mountain for your graptolites, that's a good area, but almost any quarry you can look for these little marks. And then if you're interested in the Carboniferous, go to Dolgoch Quarry, the Oswestry Hills. Next, please. Okay, and here is your bibliography. There's some very, very interesting books, and this will tell you dear old Richard Fortey, who sadly died not long ago, a very, very racy author, shall I say, but he was a trilobite expert at the Natural History Museum and has written extensively about trilobites and life and other things as well. Yeah, so
these are all books that Sally's used to bring this talk together.
Yeah. There's reading for months and months, and you need to get enthused about it. Next. Oh God, yeah, we thought we'd pop this in because if you if you Google some geologists of importance to Shropshire,
which obviously Sally did in researching this talk,
yeah,
that's what
it's
comes up.
extremely flattered to find that just behind the great luminaries of Murchison and Lapworth and even Peter Toggett, there is Dr. Sally Green, which has really destroyed my faith in AI. It's only because I've got my YouTube lectures I have become a very important geologist. Never mind, I don't.
So do not implicitly trust AI. Always
Okay.
get a second opinion.
Yeah. So thank you very much. That's a very condensed rush through the Shropshire fossils, and I hope it's
So
enthused you to get out into the country this coming summer because it's coming soon. Yay! You can forget the gloom, get your magnifying glass, your geological hammer, your hard hat, and your books. And good luck to you finding.
we're into the realms of prolixity, logorrhea, and bloviation now. So
Okay.
thank you anyway. Do take note of the donate button on our website, and if you feel you've enjoyed the lecture, then make a donation.